You actually changed shirts since your keynote.
I think we should get started in a little bit back there. You guys ready? Excellent. All right. Welcome, everyone, to this Tools as a Catalyst for Change. I'm Paul St. John. I've been at GitHub for about 3.5 years. I head up sales for GitHub worldwide. With me, we've got, introduce yourself a little bit.
Yeah, my name's Bill Higgins. I'm a distinguished engineer at IBM, and for the past 2.5 years, I've been leading our tools rollout.
Get the bird next.
Yeah.
What's that?
Who are you?
Introduce the bird.
A guest speaker.
Oh, I didn't see it.
At least it has all its feet.
Oh, no.
So Jason Warner, SVP of Technology at GitHub. Been here for 4 months.
Awesome. So we started working with IBM back in 2015, March 2015. Funny to get a call from IBM. It was a big account. We thought, okay, what's going on here? It's going to be interesting. They wanted to start a push into cloud and cognitive, and they thought we should look at GitHub as a way to get us ready to do that kind of coding, and it was a good journey. We've been working super close with IBM. They're our largest customer. They're one of our largest partners we go out to market and we work with. So Bill Higgins wrote an article, hit the Medium. It's posted on Medium, right?
Yep, Medium.
And that came out what?
Like 4 months ago, maybe?
4 months ago. So that article is the basis for this talk. We'll try to get the link out to you before the end of the show, but it's based upon that. So just to kick things off, I'm going to moderate, and I'm going to let these guys do the talking. They're the engineers here, and they're going to be best at explaining how culture change comes about and the effect tools has on that. So first question, just to set the stage, is culture is bandied about as a word that's used in lots of different contexts. What does it mean to have culture change as an engineer?
Yeah, you want me to go first? Sure. Yeah, so culture, like Paul said, is one of those words that people say, but I don't think a lot of people really understand what it means, and a lot of people don't understand how to actually change it. So to get really concrete, because we're engineers, so we like to talk about things that are real. I had visited a friend of mine who at the time was CTO at Etsy, and we were talking about starting a consortium around resilience and digital infrastructure. And I went to Etsy, and I saw that the way that they developed was radically different from IBM. Continuous delivery, chat ops, but also the collaboration between developers. Anybody in Etsy could see the code of anybody else. And so I thought, just as a thought experiment, what if IBM worked a little bit more like Etsy? And what would it be like for developing Watson and cloud and all that stuff? And what we realized was that it was going to require a fundamental culture change, which meant our policies, the way we approach failure. And so to me, the culture is really about the kind of the tacit assumptions about how you work, what is rewarded, what is expected, what is sanctioned, and yeah, that's what it means to me.
So pretty similar, to be honest. So I think that it comes down to a lot of those expectations, sanctions, and things that you just say, this is part of who we are and this is how we're going to do it, but also this is allowed, this is not allowed, this is enforced, this is not enforced, this is looked the other way. I think of it as, you can see healthy and unhealthy of all types of delivery models, but when it comes to the culture of a place, the way you work sometimes infuses how you react as well. So I think of it this way too, like CI/CD as a culture model is interesting because what that forces you to do is feedback loops have to be tight. And the way that works is if you're getting information very quickly, what do you do differently when your feedback loops are long versus when they're long? And there's a lot of different ways you can take that, but when it comes to culture and tools, I think of that as like, what are you trying to optimize for?
Awesome. So that's when you're putting a tool out there, though, and you're looking at maybe a set of tools you put together. What were your set of tools that you put together? It wasn't just GitHub. What did you have?
Yeah, the first set of tools that we rolled out were GitHub, Slack, and then as a second set we did Travis CI. Oh, sorry, Mural was part of the first set. And we had kind of looked at some of the cultural pathologies at IBM. And one of the big ones that we saw were these gaps between the different disciplines. Engineering didn't really get along with design, didn't really get along with offering management. And one thing that we noticed was that they tended to work in different tools. Like we found this one case where a product management team didn't even have access to the backlog, the engineering team's backlog. And so the first set of tools that we picked were tools that really facilitated interdisciplinary collaboration, like GitHub, like Mural, like Slack. And over time, just the proximity started to get these folks understanding each other better, valuing what each other did, and starting to actually collaborate versus just merely coordinate.
I like what you said there about trying to get them to talk, because that's one of those things, if you understand that you're optimizing for this dysfunction that is that their organizations don't even interact with each other, you can at least understand what you're trying to solve. And it's the fundamental, hey, what problem you're trying to solve, and then what are you trying to get out of this? If you have organizations that talk well together but they're slow, it looks very different, and you might have a different choice.
Rolling out that tool set, you wrote in your article about difficulty with when a team might not want to do it and how you dealt with that. So just sort of, like, I don't want to, no way. What do you do?
Right, yeah, so there's always inertia and complacency because lots of people are comfortable with what they're doing, even if their business results aren't great. So what we did was, since IBM's a massive company, obviously, we could find the people who wanted to embrace this. So a lot of the new hires had already used GitHub in college, or they'd used it for open source projects. Some of the industry hires were the same. Some of the longtime IBMers had been frustrated with business outcomes, and so they wanted to try. So what we did was we tried to find those folks, the champions, to start adopting the tools, and when they demonstrated success through this better way of working, then we would very intentionally do internal marketing to shine a light on them and say, look what this team did from a business perspective, and then work backwards to their different way of working. And so then, as opposed to us being change agents saying, hey, you should work differently, people would look at their peer teams who were having better results, and kind of natural human curiosity and jealousy, they'd say, maybe I should try that. And then we started to see that diffusion curve of the early adopters infecting the early majority, and then finally dragging along some of the late majority, which is where we're at right now.
No addition there? Cool.
I wasn't inside IBM for this one.
So, yeah, no. I didn't know if you had a similar
Yeah, that was before Jason's time.
That's true,
he got here after it's like, hey, we've got this massive installation, we have to make more performant. Help!
That's right. When I first went to IBM and they were doing this change, you also did physical changes. They took me to Somers, which was a big IBM campus, and there were like two sides to it. You'd walk in one door, and if you turn left, it would be green and open with whiteboards and open. And then if you turn right, it'd be like dismal, like Department of whatever.
Yeah, I think of it as like the Wizard of Oz. I think of it like the Wizard of Oz when you're in Kansas versus when you're in Oz. You turn left, you're in 100%. Kansas, right, you're in Oz.
Yeah, in the black and white Kansas.
Right, exactly.
So, did change matter? Did the physical change also matter with that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we, like Paul said, we had these kind of cube farms in very, very dismal locations. And so part of our CEO is named Ginny Rometty. She is a big proponent for the adoption of a better culture, agile practices, et cetera. So along with the tool investments, they also made a bunch of real estate investments to create open spaces, just more light. But there's actually an interesting analogy because I sort of think of the physical open spaces as the physical analog to the digital open spaces. Whereas before, teams might have been compartmentalized, where if Jason and I are in a different team, he can't see my code, I can't see his code. Now we're in an open space, GitHub, where we can see each other's code and more easily share back and forth. It's sort of the same thing in the physical spaces. You might go to the water cooler and hear somebody talk about something that sparks an idea.
I remember, so I started my career at IBM right out of college. I was working in Southbury, Connecticut at Global Services, and I remember walking into the building, and it was like one of those kind of like flicker light scenarios, with the halogens overhead, and it was kind of like depressing or eye twitch type of stuff. And I got an offer to go work for another company about 2 years into that, and it was it was the first .com bust. I'm not sure what number of .com bust we're on at the moment, but this is the first one, and I remember the physical location was the first thing that you're like, okay, this could be different. This could actually be fun. There's colors and all that sort of stuff. But then when you saw how often they were releasing software there and how they were doing it, that was the moment I was like, okay, so there is something a little bit different. I remember going back after that interview saying, oh dear God, no.
Bill, how hard was it to change management? Like, you had an idea. You wanted to go and do this and get these tools in there and have culture change, and you had to start somewhere. You had to start on some project. So did you intentionally pick this particular project? And then how did you get management buy-in to let you experiment with this? Inside IBM, which really, if you think about it, it's, you got to change a big ship. So how did you get management buy-in on that?
Yeah.
How did you make the elephant dance?
How we make the elephant dance.
He said, how did you make the elephant dance?
Very good book.
Which is a good one.
So we started with just the practitioners. We intentionally started in stealth mode. We didn't want to come out and say, hey, everybody, we're going to change the culture, because then everybody rightfully turns you off. So we started by doing very real things, like making GitHub available to people, saying that it's okay to have public repositories within the overall system. And so we started to get the practitioner adoption. And then we actually did get some pushback from some parts of management. Some managers, because of bias or not wanting the churn of changing tools, tried to push back against it. But there was enough momentum and enough adoption that at some point the executive team came around. At some point, the head of Watson actually said, this is really great stuff. And then we started to get those executive champions, and then we could shine a light on them as executive champions, just like we used to shine a light on the teams as local people having success. So we were fortunate in that we had some really progressive leaders like David Kenny of Watson and Rob Thomas of Analytics, who became executive champions because they knew that to be more competitive, their teams had to, there's a saying like, to be better, you have to be different by definition. And so they wanted their teams to get much better. And so they became great champions for the tools.
Did you see real? Did they see real? I mean, a lot of management is like, okay, that's all great. Everybody's happy. That's cool. Can recruit better. But I want to see output. I want to see something that gets out to the street, that makes money or cuts costs. Or did they see real output out of this project? Is that what spurred it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one thing to remember about companies like IBM and other older software companies is that we didn't start on the cloud. We didn't start with SaaS. We started from on-premises delivery. And we needed to shift to cloud and SaaS. And so to do that, we needed a fundamentally different way of working. So these general managers and senior VPs whose jobs and bonuses depend on having better results, it was in their selfish interest to have their teams work better, so they were highly motivated. They weren't trying to be nice. It was for their own interest.
So I'm curious, how long did it take you to go from evangelizing to where you thought you hit a different curve inside IBM? Because time horizons inside a large enterprises like that can be very different than what you think about.
Yeah, I think we saw good organic growth over the first, just kind of viral practitioners talking to practitioners, teams talking to teams over the first year or so. And I'm probably going to have some revisionist history. I'm looking at David here because he remembers better than I do. But I remember there was this one meeting. We have this meeting where Arvind Krishna, our head of research in hybrid cloud, has all the development VPs from around the company, and they make decisions. And there was this one meeting where we were talking about should we all go into GitHub? And there was...
Yes.
Yeah, Paul agrees as the head of GitHub sales. And there were a few VPs who spoke up and said, yeah, we should do GitHub, but we should also do a common continuous deployment tool, and we want the project was called Whitewater. We want the Whitewater team to do it. And it was at that point, it was like, wow, this is going to be sustainable. I was really worried about the sustainability because I don't know how many people work in big companies. It's very easy for a change initiative to get killed. Oftentimes they don't get enough momentum and then they just get killed. So that was always the worry with our project. But it was in that one meeting about a year in when we had a couple pretty powerful executives speak up and say, we need to do more of this, that I thought this is going to become, I mean, we still have to work hard. There's lots of work to do. But this is going to be self-sustaining as long as you don't make any big mistakes.
A tool is a tool. You had the phrase in there.
No, it's not mine. It's not mine.
Okay, but talk about that and what that meant to you.
Oh, right. Yeah, so there's a guy at IBM named Grady Booch, who some of you may know. He used to write books on UML and object-oriented programming. Good friend. And he had this saying a long time ago, which is, a fool with a tool is still a fool. And I strongly agree with that. And what it means is you can give a great tool to a lousy team and don't expect them to become a great team. And so what we saw with the early adoption of the tools that we brought out, like GitHub and Slack, is that there was this kind of self-selection bias where people who already understood the value of the tools, but more importantly, the modern practices that those tools enabled, were the first adopters and showed immediate value because they knew how to use the tool right. And then the folks who were kind of compelled to use the tools because their executives told them to really struggled because, maybe I'll get a little bit concrete. So in GitHub, you can certainly commit right to master, But in my opinion, you're much better off if you're creating pull requests, having those code reviewed, iterating on those as part of a continuous delivery process. So in both cases, you're getting the code into master, but in very different ways. And so about a year in, we realized that to get the next 30,000 users, we would have to really invest in helping people understand the better practices that the tools enable but do not force upon you.
What's your take on that? I mean, just tooling in general. Like you're doing this, right? You got your team, you got your tools, you're trying to figure out your processes. Is there a standard that you go by? Like this is the combo I like, or?
I think context matters, which optimization you're making, things like that. I think that the fool the tool scenario is, we see that all the time, I think in tech in general, is that bad buying decisions for the wrong reasons lead to bad outcomes. Adoption of technologies is also one of those things that can fall by the wayside if someone's using the whatever it be inappropriately. I remember way back when, I think it was 2006, we were doing some experiments at the company I was at in cloud computing, just starting. Amazon was just releasing some stuff. Someone decided to write a POC of a thing, and it was terrible because they were trying to use an old world style of work with this new service, and they try to shove all this data through it, and the way it was working, it's like, oh, look at this, the latency is terrible. But if you change the way you use the tool, if you change to work more like that too, and you understand why, and that's the important part, is you understand why that thing exists and why you go that way, you can ultimately have a better outcome, but you can also understand more about what's going on and why this whole thing might actually be meaningful. And I think that was my biggest learning in all the years in tech, is that people adopt things for the wrong reasons without understanding why. And then they say, this doesn't work because it doesn't look just like this other thing that I know how to use exactly. Databases are a common example of that to me.
Yeah, I think GitHub is in a really unique position to help with this because they are the UI that, I don't know, how many users do you have? Millions?
24 million registered users.
Yeah, 24 million users are in, and they're in GitHub all day. And so I kind of laugh because we spend so much time teaching machine these days with machine learning and building models and things like that. And I think there's actually a huge opportunity for companies like GitHub and Slack to actually teach humans by having UIs that kind of hint at these better practices, or maybe Miju's data insights team can say, hey, I see you're working like this. Have you considered working like that? And here's why, like you said, in the context of how they're working. So I know you've talked about that a little bit. I think that's a huge opportunity area to bring software development forward.
For sure, and it's part of the whole learn side of the GitHub story that we have talked about internally quite a bit, but it's definitely something that Chris is super passionate about as well. And we think about the next wave of developers, we think about the next generation of folks who are going to be meaningfully making change in the world. And Miju and I actually go back and forth on this quite a bit, and we think about this. I'm an old infrastructure person. I actually don't understand the data science world that well. How do I meaningfully understand and get access to that side of the world, and how does she understand infrastructure? Even us old industry vets have new tricks to learn too.
Right. Yeah, and sometimes it's harder for us because we've had some degree of success, and so the human nature is to just keep doing what you're doing because it's worked for you. It's kind of gotten you to where you're getting to. But as the world changes, you have to be ready to adapt. You have to be ready to learn better practices. The previous CIO at IBM, Jeff Smith, had this great saying, which was, there are 6 billion people in the world. Somebody is doing what you do better than you are. Find them and bring it back here. And I think it really takes a curiosity and a humility to constantly have that mindset and bring those ideas back into the companies and then try to spread them.
So when you think about a tool choice, we're going to do one more question here, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience. We're about halfway through, and we'll turn it out, do your questions, and then one final question for the two guys up here. But thinking about tool choices in general, how do you look? I mean, if the tool and the culture somehow intertwine, you spoke about that in your article, but what do you look at a horizon on a tool versus you pick a tool, and how do you expect it? Like 3 years, 5 years? Is this something that'll live with you? Do you expect the company to iterate on it? You see what I mean? It's like you're betting your culture on this. You have a tool. How does that all go hand in hand with long-term thought and how you pick what you pick?
Right. So our rule of thumb was, if we can't plausibly imagine this tool still being used at high scale 5 years from now, don't even bother with it. because the cost of replacement and the cost of retraining is just so incredibly high. And that was one of the reasons that tools like GitHub and Slack were so attractive, because they're kind of like de facto standards. I mean, I know there's competitors. Are there competitors?
There are competitors, but that's why GitHub, if you saw the roadmap that Jason talked about, we're trying to remake the landscape here and make it more platform. But I didn't know if you think of
5 years.
5 years?
Minimum 5 years,
Minimum 5
but ideally forever. Just because you want to spend time on building a better Watson or building a better cloud versus churning on tools every 2 years.
And there's a big culture shakeup when a tool comes in, or not? Or is the culture just kind of steady and then it just either eats the tool up or doesn't?
Well, we've had different uptake of tools. The biggest uptake has been on GitHub and Slack. Other ones don't get quite the uptake for various reasons. And so I think the best case is when both the doers, like the developers or the designers, and the leaders, the executive leaders,
100%.
see the value, and they kind of selfishly want to adopt those tools because they think they'll either write better code or have better business results.
That makes sense. Anything?
Yeah, I think it's funny because I don't have a number in terms of years, but I look at a couple of different avenues of decisions. One is a decision that I would never ever want to replace, something that's so fundamental, and those are rare. Those are not that common. And then there's ones that are just like a high friction cost to replace. And I usually think about those as 2.5 to 3 years. And right now, like the one of the most common examples from a programming perspective is the front end frameworks. Stuff that's going on is that every couple of months it seems like something is kind of waning and another one's coming up. And the cost of switching is incredibly high. And if you're on an old version of a thing, so it's incredibly frustrating when you're thinking about it from a CIO, CTO perspective of what you're making your bets on. So it doesn't even have that time horizon. But I definitely want to make at least 3 years because the friction of switching and the cost of switching is so high.
Do you notice the photographer came out when I got off stage? Thanks. Questions from the group here?
Or comments, your own experiences.
Questions, comments, your experience with tools as well. Any first takers, break the ice?
I just want, when you said that quote from, was it Brady Goose or?
Grady, yeah.
I actually had used that quote once before, and I actually nearly got fired for saying it.
Oh, you got fired for saying it?
Almost. They were.
Oh, okay.
They didn't like to actually hear that you actually needed to understand how the tool was going to be used, and just bringing the tool in wouldn't fix all their problems.
Yeah, I mean, people are always kind of hungry for easy answers, but in my experience, it takes blood, sweat, and tears to actually do something meaningful.
Luckily, actually, they got fired.
They got fired.
They ended up getting fired.
Excellent. There is justice in the world.
Hi there. We just got paid Slack at my company.
Can you talk a little closer to the mic?
Sorry, we got paid Slack at my company just like in the last few weeks. The developers had seen the benefit in it for years. Developers think of all this stuff as like awesome. We had a tough time convincing the business leaders and the executives and just like the business people that weren't necessarily leaders, like of the value of that stuff. How do you guys get people to use new technologies that maybe the developers see as just like normal always? And how do you convince people of the value of those kind of things?
So I got an easy answer for this one. We need more technical CEOs. No, I'm not joking about that. As an industry, I think we need more technical CEOs. I think people have come up through the trenches and been developers and get to that ranks. I think that the trade-offs that you make, and I think the decisions that you do, we as an industry don't do that. If you go through and actually inventory people who are our CEOs these days, they come out of marketing, they come out of product, and they come out of sales. No offense, Paul. But I mean, there's a reason why
I'm
that
your favorite
is.
sales guy.
Yes, you are my favorite sales guy. My current favorite sales guy. But there's a reason why historically that's the case. But I just think as an industry, if we have more technical CEOs over time, stuff like that is actually an easier conversation. But in the meantime, the best way I've found to convince executives of the value of things is you have to make the compelling pro-con other case, which is what's the cost of not doing this, and you put it in cost dollar per conversations.
Yeah, we got a little bit lucky, I think, because some of our executives were fairly enlightened, like David Kenny from Watson. He's a technical person, so he had kind of seen the value himself, And so he just kind of got it. And then once we had a few of those executive on board, the ones who didn't really get it, we could just say, well, you should talk to David. And then they could have a senior level conversation about why David was motivated as a senior VP to adopt a certain technology in his organization. So I don't know if he had that luxury, but that's how we did it.
Yeah, no, I mean, people are very open to everything. I guess for me, it's a lot of this stuff seems really natural to developers, and a lot of folks that aren't developers or technical people, like you said, like they just, it doesn't like click to them quite as fast, like why this would make such a big difference. Because like Slack, honestly, I don't know how I would live without Slack on a development team. So I guess that's what I'm kind of trying to get at from like an emotional side, like how do you get people to buy into tools that don't necessarily seem natural to them?
I don't know if you can from an emotional side, except that every once in a while I will have to play that card if I'm in a very privileged position all of a sudden at GitHub and then previously at Heroku. But if on the flip side, early in my career, you build relationships, one, so that you can pull out this next card, which is the trust me card. Let me show you the value of this thing. Trust me, give me a little bit of runway to do this. I can't show you on paper because you won't feel and see the difference. Give me 3 months. Let me show you this thing.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add is, I don't know how big your company is.
I work for Slalom Consulting, but I work in the St. Louis office, which is only like 80 people, but it's like a 5,000 person firm.
So at IBM, what I've found is it's big enough that there's always somebody in HR or in finance or wherever who gets it and can be your champion. And then the pattern I use is just work with that person, help make them successful, even if we have to spend serious effort to make them successful, write integrations for them, whatever, and then shine a light on them so that it spreads from their success.
All right, thanks guys.
Thank you, Dan. Anybody else? Yep.
So the conversation is really focused on the private sector, and I remember from GitHub Universe last year, you guys had, I think, a representative from the Obama administration, as well as I think someone from the Canadian government. What are you continuing to see adoption in the public sector?
Is David Iden here? Yeah. Why don't you come up?
Is that related to our talk? Is that related to our talk?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's being recorded. Just don't let any three-letter acronyms slip out too much.
Well, first thing I was going to say, you were about to say, Paul, the Department of something as being a glum and horrible place earlier, and I was going to call you out on that later, but now I'll call you out in front of everyone. The answer is yes, there has been tremendous adoption. So I'm the federal rep, I'm Dave Ide. The federal government is always slow to adopt things, probably the same for any government, but at the end of the day, we're at the point now with GitHub and these types of technologies that it's table stakes, it's power and cooling, it just has to get done. So the answer is yes, there's massive adoption, mainly on the enterprise side, still a little scared of .com for perceived security. That's kind of a religious discussion almost, so we don't do it, but we're taking steps to make that simpler, and adoption's going great.
So this is, I won't answer for GitHub in this sense here. However, I live in Victoria, British Columbia, and I'm in the local tech community up there, working with the government and things like this. There's a local scene called Techtoria up there. It's kind of fun. However, every time you have to have a conversation with the government sector, I thought IBM decision making was slow. This is
It's
hey,
kind
whatever.
of like government.
That's Canadian government too, so it's 60% watered down. But it is incredibly frustrating because you don't ever feel that anyone is empowered to make a decision, nor has the budget. Or if someone has the ability to make a decision, they don't have the budget, and then you have to make two government agencies talk to each other just to do any simple thing, and that's an incredibly frustrating experience. And if you're doing it nights and weekends, it's just almost not worth your time. So, God's work trying to solve the government. So.
Well, we actually were meeting with someone earlier who had said, in the day, it's a few years ago, it was very difficult to talk about open source. And sort of mid-level management and down were, no, we're not going to do open source. But the luxury for inspired leaders, I guess, was, well, the president, Obama, had put out you're going to use open source as much as you can. They had air cover. So they could say, look, can't really challenge this. It's coming from the top that we should be doing this. So that kind of air cover in government, as well as air cover in some of the more enlightened businesses we work with, it's really beneficial, top down, to say we're going to start looking at things like this. And I think you got that same statement from IBM when they had the right VPs who were pushing this.
Yeah, one nice thing is that there's been some amazing people from the tech industry go into government with the explicit goal of changing the culture and demonstrating better ways of working. Like, I don't know if you know Jez Humble, he wrote some books on continuous delivery. He went to work for I forget which website it was, with the explicit goal of showing that continuous delivery can work in a federal agency, and he succeeded. So I think there's some of that will help.
Hi. I was wondering if, this conference and throughout other conferences I've been to, I've heard a lot about team dynamics and how traditional companies usually look at teams as top-down order takers, maybe in some cases, but the shift is kind of towards more decentralized teams without the hierarchy, and those teams have been found to be more productive in some cases. I'm wondering if you guys have seen that to be true throughout some of the transformations you've seen, or maybe not true.
I mean, what I've seen is that, you know, you've got these buzzwords like DevOps and Agile, and there's actually real thinking behind them and real experience behind them. And the risk is that a company will say, let's become Agile, and not really understand what it means. But the good case is where an executive really understands a principle like, I'm going to define an outcome, an aggressive, ambitious outcome, and then assemble an interdisciplinary, talented team to achieve that outcome. And then we'll have regular, we call them playbacks, where we see the progress towards that and the ability to course correct as necessary. But I guess for me, it really depends on the leader, to Jason's point, understanding the why behind the new way of working, and then actually making that the culture. And in my experience, it's hit or miss. Sometimes the leaders get it, sometimes they don't. I guess you probably see this. Every company you talk to, we're already Agile, we already do DevOps. It's like, well, why aren't you kicking ass?
Yeah, this to me is one of those things where people actually look for a tool to solve a human problem, but it's fundamentally a human problem. And to me, at the end of the day, it comes down to organizational dynamics and leadership, frankly.
Leadership.
And the different styles that will and won't work, and that will resonate and won't resonate. And at the end of the day, I think that it comes down to that we as an industry probably need to do better on that. But we are seeing most of the trend go to that. Decentralized context at the top, push decision making as far down the stack as possible, allow people to be autonomous but accountable in a transparent way, and then they can run as long as the outcomes are there. The model is hard and it's kind of scary if you've never seen it before, but it's also the one that is it's trending in the right way. We're seeing more places are operating this way, and all the data shows that is the best way to work.
Hey. So I work in the financial services industry, which is similar to government in that there's a lot of slow decision making and restrictions on what we can jump to. Things like GitHub and Slack, that I think a lot of people now take for granted as like that's the tool. Also have enterprise level things that make it easier for regulated industries to take part in. Are there tools that you guys are seeing come down the pipeline that you think in the future are going to be like these tools that everyone's looking around and being like, you're not on Slack, you're not on GitHub, like what are you doing? But that also might have the foundational like support for people like in government and financial industries to actually adapt and push for like things that are a little less scrappy and more like we can actually push this for empowerment of developers in those industries.
I'll take my first stab. I think the most obvious, largest to tackle one is the entire idea of cloud computing. And this is at the government level, this is at the regulation level, and if we all just kind of look at what's happening in Europe right now from a policy perspective and what is being demanded of people to operate in Germany as an example, we kind of have to sort that out as I don't know if there's a global consortium of companies that can actually do this, but like just the fact of like what's happening over there from the GDPR perspective and what the regulation is saying they have to do. And if each country adopts a certain flow on that, cloud computing is you're never going to see that kind of uptake. This to me is the most obvious one to have this conversation around because it's so critical to get this kind of sorted quickly. That's not a tool, it's more of this big old perspective, but Slack runs in the cloud, we run in the cloud, all these tools actually do run in the cloud, and if you can't actually use any of those because of the precursor, the foundational element isn't allowed to be there, we're in a lot of trouble.
Hi, I'm curious if there's any tools you tried to deploy as part of one of these cultural changes that didn't work out, and if so, if you have a feeling on why that one didn't. You don't have to name the actual tool if you want to not call anyone out.
Throw people under the bus publicly. I mean, not so much that they got outright rejected, but there were certainly ones that didn't get the kind of uptake that we'd wanted. Where we started with GitHub and Slack and Mural, and they pretty much overnight had greater than 10,000 users. We naively thought that every additional tool would have the same dynamic. But for instance, we tried to put a CI tool out there, and it got a couple thousand users, but it couldn't displace Jenkins, and it couldn't displace some of the other tools, just because people were really tied to it. So I don't really know what the formula is that causes one tool to get that sort of viral adoption and another tool not to. But I guess in a company of our size, you can always, put out something good and get a couple thousand users, but the question is, will it hit that tipping point and get the entire internal market?
Well, I guess good afternoon. I have two questions actually. What tools do you think I'm going to be using in my 20s, and how would that okay, this is probably going to be a silly question, but
this is the youngest conference attendee, by the way.
Okay, yeah.
Amazing.
Do you think the government's going to speed up their processing? Because
You mean the current government?
well, no, when I mean my 20s. If you can answer that.
I don't. My opinion is that the government will only do something when pressured to do something. Unless you have a very progressive person ultimately in charge of that, the government will move as slow as it is allowed to move, for lack of a better definition. I think Obama kind of pushing that from the top in the open source is an example of someone who saw a trend, needed to get in front of it, and wanted to push a progressive stance. And I think that the only way that the current government, or even probably future governments, if they're not as progressive, think about changing their stance on things is basically industry pressure. And I don't like that, because I don't like companies influencing government to that degree, but I think that there has to be some understanding of what the impact of a decision like this is going to mean for the people in that country.
Right. I guess one kind of concrete story on that is probably before your time. Probably a lot of things are before your time. But about during the Obama administration, they passed the healthcare bill, and they put up this website, healthcare.gov, and it was just a total dumpster fire. The site didn't really work for people. It was always going down. So it created a crisis. And there's this saying, I forget who it came from, but it's don't let a good crisis go to waste. So because of that crisis, Obama surveyed various thought leaders in the industry about how can we get better. And it was through that he started to hear about continuous delivery and many deployments a day. And they made those foundational to rebuilding healthcare.gov, and then it became healthy over time. So sometimes those crises are necessary for government to change.
Sure.
Last one, make it great.
Yep. Oh, no pressure. Hi, I joined GitHub a few months ago, actually, same time as Jason. So I thought coming in it was just all about code, SCM, and then quickly learned that here we use it for everything, even planning this event, right? So I'm curious, in an implementation as large as IBM, is that happening? Do you see that? How much is code versus, other creative uses, if you will, that aren't just, tied to developers?
Yeah, well, it certainly started with what we think of as sort of the hardcore developers, the ones who use every feature. But then over time, it kind of branched out into people who were just using issues or just using ecosystem tools like ZenHub to work on backlogs and things like that. Or even one funny thing we saw was one day we saw an influx of 3,000 new users, and we were like, what the heck just happened? Because that never happens. And what it was is that our CISO group had put out an overhauled security standard to be more agile, and everybody had rushed to GitHub Pages to read it. And so that was kind of a fun surprise.
That was a good day.
Yeah, Paul drank the good stuff that day.
Listen, we're wrapping up here, so just want to say thank you for the question makers. and the question takers. So it's been a very nice session. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much. Yes. Yeah. Okay, GSA is speaking next about government doing open source somewhere out there in the next one. So check it out.
So no more government jokes?
Yeah, best behavior, everyone.
Everybody. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks.